Hi. In this session, we're going to be looking at China's changing grand strategy. As China emerges as a major power in Asia and one of the leading powers in the world, what's clear is that its behavior has been changing. And so in this session, I want to take a look and tell you a little bit about the history of China's grand strategy, which is essentially how China views itself in the international system and what its role is, both in terms of maintaining international stability and what the implications of that are for its own domestic politics. I want to secondly talk about how China's grand strategy has been shifting in recent years as the country has emerged as one of the top economies, one of the more powerful militaries in the region. And finally, I want to think a little bit about what are the implications of this shifting grand strategy for the country's domestic reform agenda. So when we talk about grand strategy in the PRC, I think it's important to point out that unlike Western countries, Chinese leaders think very holistically about security. They don't separate the domestic realm from the international realm quite as starkly as Western security strategists like to. In many respects, the national interest for China is domestic stability, and that's what allows it to achieve its international objectives. And so in many respects, the way it behaves internationally might have impact for its own domestic stability and vice versa. And so we want to think about what is China's grand strategy, how do they formulate this, and what are its implications. When we talk about grand strategy, it's important to point out that foreign policy making in China has been characterized by factions. Just like within domestic politics, there are more nationalistic, conservative elements that want to see China push for a stronger, more assertive, more aggressive role in the international system. They also tend to be more disdainful of international institutions like the UN or other institutions, and therefore see China retaking this leading role in the international system and having the means and capabilities to do this in a very independent and perhaps aggressively nationalist way. On the other hand, you have the more pragmatic oriented individuals, more often located in the foreign ministry, who see that China has benefited from an open international trading system, from a system that's characterized by relative international stability, and that they understand that China's continued cooperation and participation through this system is what's going to keep that kind of stable international environment that allows China to focus on its domestic policy objectives. One of the things that's happened more recently is that there have been efforts to institutionalize and formalize the foreign policy making decision process. And so China has recently created a National Security Committee, which is analogous to the National Security Council system in the US, which allows for interministerial communication and dialogue over key foreign policy issues. However, in the Chinese system, despite these moves to make the institutions more transparent and more streamlined, there are concerns that there are certain individuals, such as the president, that might be able to call the shots individually, that decisions are not made by a committee, but that there are, in fact, leaders and top individuals who matter more so than the collective committee. And in this regard, I think this is an important thing to keep in mind, is that foreign policy can be driven by the individual or can be driven by different factional interests. Part of the difficulty in understanding Chinese policy is that sometimes those things are not exactly clear to the observer. What is clear is that the government is trying to centralize and regularize decision-making authority, that there has been a move to make sure that foreign policy decision-making is done at the top echelons. And I think these reform efforts are in some ways reflective of that. Let me give you a little bit of background on Chinese grand strategy. If you go back to the Maoist period, from when Mao was controlling China from 1949 to 1976, national interests in China were defined by communism. Domestic struggle, a class struggle, was mirrored by international class struggle, that the building of communism domestically should be mirrored by exporting communism internationally. And so China's foreign policy during this time and security strategy during this time had a couple of important characteristics. First was a very nationalistic impulse to reassert territorial control, that China had been victimized by Western powers and Japan for over a century. And so an important nationalistic goal of Mao was to reassert territorial control over areas that they believed were traditionally Chinese. So this includes areas such as Tibet and Xinjiang, as well as claims to territory that may have been disputed, a number of border disputes with India, as well as claims to Taiwan and other areas that have fallen outside of Chinese control. So all of these territorial claims fit within a broader nationalist discourse about making China stand up, reasserting Chinese sovereignty. So sovereignty and the inviolability of sovereignty has been an important grand strategy objective for the Chinese since the founding of the PRC. In terms of its relations, there was a preference for bilateralism and a rejection of international institutions, as well as a somewhat messianic ideology of exporting communist insurgency, that China was fundamentally trying to overthrow the established world order and support revolutions and insurgencies internationally. And so this was an important component to security thinking under Mao. This shifted significantly once Deng Xiaoping came to power and was able to consolidate power. In contrast to Mao, Deng rejected messianic views of changing the international system or changing the world order, and was more pragmatic in recognizing that China itself was a very poor country that had huge economic developmental challenges. So in order to try and focus on addressing these developmental challenges, Deng Xiaoping asserted a doctrine of keeping a low profile. And this essentially says that instead of being grandiose or playing a strong or leading role internationally, that China should keep a low profile internationally. And that the core to their security strategy was domestic stability and development. That ideology was no longer the glue that was going to hold society and the system together, that the government needed to start performing economically. And so development was the means to achieving this core national security goal of domestic stability and sovereignty. This involved the suppression of domestic opposition, and so the Tiananmen Square crackdown is seen as a continuation of a long-term development strategy, that it might be unsavory, but from the Chinese perspective, it was a means to an end in order to continue this development strategy, and so it was important from a security standpoint in that regard. More recently, under recent administrations, this idea of keeping a low profile was reformulated as China's peaceful rise. That is, that China needed to maintain a harmonious and stable international system in order to facilitate its focus on economic development at home. And so this focus on international stability has led to some outreach, some diplomacy with its Asian neighbors in order to try and develop better relations and not rocking the boat too much. And to a large extent, this was a successful strategy. China was able to develop for over 3 decades at almost double-digit growth rates. So in many respects, this strategy has been successful. China has avoided international entanglements in order to focus on domestic issues, domestic development. However, what's clear is that as China has risen, as it has become a more powerful country, as it has become a larger global economy, this strategy of maintaining a low profile is unsustainable. There's a fundamental disjuncture between the strategy and China's place in the world. And that it is no longer the case that China can afford to be a middle power or a power that does not take a leading role, because too many issues originate in China or impact China. So whether it be issues such as labor force, whether it be environment, whether it be international security, China is now too important to simply take a hands-off approach. What's interesting is that while China's existing grand strategy is unsustainable and will almost certainly need to shift, I would argue that many China security analysts drew the wrong conclusions from the 2008 financial crisis. And what we have seen since 2008 is a perceptible shift in China's international profile. That in many respects, Chinese leaders viewed the US, and by extension the West, as overstretched, facing enormous fiscal challenges, and incapable of maintaining a leading role in the world. In essence, the US was a system on the decline. By contrast, China skated through the economic crisis. They did relatively well. And so many people believe that China's system of authoritarian, strong state involvement in the economy was in fact a superior system, and that this was the point at which China was overtaking the US. The view that China has overtaken the West in terms of material wealth or military capabilities is somewhat overblown. And I think this in fact reflects a misperception on Chinese strategic thinking rather than a reality that China has actually overtaken the US and the rest. And so what's important is that we should expect that China will emerge as a great power, that China will start to play a stronger role. But what role that is, I think, remains somewhat ambiguous. And so there are both optimists and pessimists about China's rise and what role we see it playing in the international system. On the pessimistic side, some scholars see a historically aggrieved China that's upset with Western colonialism, that's upset with the history of Japanese colonialism, and views the international order as essentially biased and discriminatory against China. In this narrative, this more nationalistic, aggrieved China seeks to overthrow the existing international system defined by U.S. security alliances and international institutions, and leads a bloc focused around the China model, or a model of illiberal authoritarian developmental states, and that this bloc and these values will be fundamentally at odds with the values of an international system that's based on universal human rights, free trade, democracy. Growing military capabilities in this regard can translate into greater confidence and greater belligerence internationally. So whether we're talking about island disputes with Japan, other territorial disputes with Southeast Asian countries, or even China's willingness to chastise U.S. leaders at high-profile international conferences, there are some indications that China has greater confidence and a greater willingness to be somewhat more aggressive and belligerent in international forums. The optimistic view is that China has benefited from an open and stable international order, that U.S. position in Asia has helped to keep its other major powers, particularly Japan, in check, and that China has many mutual economic interests with the US and the West. Whereas in the Cold War, we would talk about mutually assured destruction from nuclear weapons, the current situation between China and the US resembles mutually assured economic destruction. And Chinese leaders know this, and then this is an important constraining factor on their foreign policy behavior. At the same time, we also see a China that has increasingly tried to portray itself as a responsible member of the international community, contributing troops for peacekeeping forces, not vetoing every single UN resolution that might be against its interests. So, for example, allowing a resolution for the intervention on Libya. This is evidence that China is increasingly a responsible member of the international community, playing a constructive role on the North Korean nuclear program is a further example. So what we see is that there is in fact evidence for both the pessimists and the optimists. China is modernizing its military quite rapidly and has engaged in some erratic and threatening behavior, in particular cyber attacks against the United States or other companies such as Google, the destruction of its own satellite using an anti-satellite weapon. It's also become more belligerent around some of these territorial disputes that I've mentioned, and there are nationalist protests against the Japanese in particular. On the other hand, China has been more engaged with multilateral institutions. It has worked through institutions such as the World Trade Organization. It's increasingly willing to engage in military exchanges with other powers. And it's tried to use its official policy pronouncements to indicate benign intentions, that it is in fact accepting of the international system and not trying to overthrow it. And as I mentioned, they've played a reasonably constructive role in the North Korean nuclear program. So there's evidence for both sides. I think China is in many respects engaged in a debate about what its role will be in the international system. And in some respects, this debate is still open. So what should we expect from China moving forward as it rises? And what should its international profile look like? I think certainly we will have more of a great power foreign policy coming from China. As China views itself as the naturally dominant power in the region, it will see itself as needing to have a foreign policy that is commensurate with that position. And so staking out claims in the South China Sea, instituting policies such as an air defense identification zone, these are all indicative of China trying to defend what it sees as its national interests and playing more of a great power role in the region. The current president has even indicated that China will play the role of a first-class power. The danger here is that the conservative nationalist hawks will in fact overreach, that China is still relatively weak relative to Japan or the United States, and it has huge developmental challenges still to be overcome. The concern is that nationalist issues such as island disputes with Japan or other regional powers may come to overshadow some of these other more important domestic issues. And to the extent that these issues allow China to become embroiled in international conflicts, this could be a major divergence from what is the most important national security policy of development, sovereignty, domestic stability. Ultimately, I think that the significant domestic needs will play a constraining factor in Chinese foreign policy. While there may be indications of a more aggressive, assertive China internationally, these things will, at least in the next few decades, still continue to be constrained by the major economic, developmental, and social challenges that China faces domestically. And so I would look for a moderation of China's position internationally at those points where it seems like it might get out of hand, as leaders recognize the danger of overreach and tend to come back to a more moderate and cooperative position.